الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh al-Maram by Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and in the last session that we had, that we were discussing in Kitab al-Ghusl, so Bab al-Ghusl wa Ukum al-Junub, where we're discussing the hadith that he mentions that describe how the Prophet ﷺ will go about performing al-Ghusl. So the author here, he mentioned several hadith, that he mentioned the hadith of Maymuna, and also he mentioned the hadith of Aisha عنها, regarding how the Prophet ﷺ would perform al-Ghusl. So inshallah ta'ala, that we are mentioning in two sessions some of those masail that relates to ahkam kayfiyat al-Ghusl, and today inshallah ta'ala in this session we'll also continue in discussing other of those masail that relates to ahkam kayfiyat al-Ghusl. So of those masail, so in continuation of those masail, that of those things that are discussed by the ulama, the fuqaha, on ahkam al-Ghusl or kayfiyat al-Ghusl, they discuss the matter regarding tasmiyat fil ghusl, which is the person saying bismillah in performing al-Ghusl. So in performing al-Ghusl is the person, what's the ruling pertaining to the person saying bismillah in performing al-Ghusl. So on this matter that they have mentioned regarding this matter, that the ulama have mentioned in general, that most have mentioned that is a general rule, that the azkar that relates to wudu and also al-Ghusl, that in most cases they are not considered to be wajib. So the azkar that are said in performing ghusl or wudu, of the ulama who take the position that they are not compulsory to be said. And those azkar that are said either before performing al-wudu or ghusl or after. So of the ulama who take that in a general rule, that those that they are not wajib, but rather they are considered to be mustahab or mashru, to be done, but not to the extent of wajib. And they discuss, is it mustahab or not mustahab? But in our particular discussion that we're having, we're discussing regarding tasmiyah fil ghusl, the person saying bismillah in performing al-ghusl. So one, they mention tasmiyah, that a person, he says bismillah, he doesn't say bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So in performing al-ghusl, the person is to say just bismillah, not for the person to say bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So as for the matter that they discuss, that they mentioned that regarding performing al-Ghusl, that either of regarding of tasmiyah, either they mentioned first, as we have said before, that al-Ghusl can be done in two ways. The way which is kamal, the perfect way or the more complete way of performing al-Ghusl, where the person, he does everything from start to the end as the Prophet ﷺ perform al-Ghusl. So he would do of al-Wudhu and also and other things, and also then perform al-Ghusl as we had stated before. But also the ulama mentioned regarding that of Ghusl, which is said ajza. So the one which is considered that mujzi, where the person, he perform just those things that are required. So the person doesn't go through all the acts regarding performing al-Wudhu, but the person will just restrict themselves to performing only those acts of Ghusl that are said to be of those one which is said to be the wajibat, which they mentioned, as we have stated before, the person washes the entire body. Also the ulama, they discussed whether the person is said to wash his nose and his mouth. But overall, that they mentioned regarding concerning that in saying bismillah in performing of ghusl, that they mentioned those two cases, those two instances. One, in the case of the person, he started his ghusl by first starting with wudhu. So he starts out by performing wudhu, then he washes his entire body after performing wudu. In that case, when he performed of wudu before al-ghusl, then the person would say bismillah. So when they start their wudu, they would say bismillah as they would ordinarily do. Even though on that matter, as we have stated before, that ulama mentioned that in saying bismillah, in starting wudu, it is not wajib. And of those who mentioned, so you have different aqwal in saying bismillah in performing wudu. Of those who mentioned it is wajib, that's the view taken by some of the Hanabila, and those who mentioned that it is wajib, so that's the view taken by some of the Hanabila, And I mentioned for the person who man dhakar or man yadhkur, the person who remembers. Amma man yasta'ath, for the person who nasiya fala. So that's a view, that the general view, that they say it is wajib. Another view is that it is something which is mustahab. That saying bismillah in performing wudu, it is mustahab. And then the third view, that is laysa mustahab. It is not mustahab. But they mention غير مشروع, as there is no authentic hadith regarding this matter. So that's concerning, so that's the view regarding and the person performing of ghusl. If he was to perform wudu before, then it goes back to the discussion regarding in performing wudu, does the person say bismillah or not? And we have just briefly mentioned the aqwal as we have discussed this in prior session before. Then we have another case. So in general, that of those who mentioned that it is not mashru', that we have the qawl of the Malikiyah, that the person not to say bismillah in performing wudu. But overall, that so that's concerning of that matter. Then the next matter is regarding the case where the person in performing of ghusl, he does not make wudu. So in performing ghusl, the person does not perform wudu. They go straight into washing their entire body, but without performing wudu prior, before, or as a part of it. So in that case where wudu is left out in performing ghusl, in that case, not ulama discuss concerning that al-iktisal bila wudu. So performing ghusl without any wudu prior, before, or at the start. So what's the hukum in saying bismillah in such case, or in this particular manner in performing ghusl? So the person does not start out with performing wudu. They go straight into wudu, washing their entire body, which is performing ghusl. So in this case, what's the aqwal of the ulama and regarding saying bismillah in such a case? So they mentioned that of the aqwal of the ulama, that of those who mention tasmiyah sunnah, of those who mention in this case the person going straight in performing ghusl without wudu before, that they mentioned their view is that saying bismillah, it is sunnah, yani mustahab. And that's the view taken by the Hanafiya and the Shafi'iyya. So the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa or the Ahnaf, and also the Shafi'iyya Shawafi', that they take the position that it is sunnah, yani mustahab, for a person to perform, to say bismillah in performing ghusl in this case. The second opinion, qeel, it is said tasmiyah min fada'il, that the second view is that it is something which is also fada'il, something which is fada'il, that's something which is virtuous to be done. So it's something which is virtuous to be done, and it is the qawl of the madhab of the Malikiyah. So this is the madhab of the Malikiyah. And there's a third opinion on this matter, that that bismillah at-tasmiyah lil janaba, that it is not mustahab for a person to say bismillah. So it is not mustahab for a person to say bismillah in performing in the case of janaba, for a junub. Then I mentioned that as for this view, that is view also, that's the madhab of also of the Shafi'iyya. So a position taken by the Shafi'iyya, so wedge the madhab al-Shafi'iyya. So those are those of the view of the ulama regarding this matter. And there's also like a fourth view. That fourth view says tajib at-tasmiyah. So this fourth opinion takes the position the person in performing ghusl, that also is compulsory upon them to say bismillah. So even though in this case the person did not start with his wudu, he goes straight into ghusl. So also they take the this is the view taken by the Hanabila. So the Hanabila, like in wudu, they say it is bismillah in starting. Also they say in ghusl it is wajib. It is wajib both in hadath al-asghar wal-akbar, which is al-wudu wal-ghusl. And so that's concerned. So these are the aqwal of the ulama in performing, saying bismillah in performing ghusl. Of those who mentioned, it is sunnah to say it. That's the view of the Ahnaf and the Shafi'iyya. The Malikiyya take the position as something which is fada'il, it is something which is virtuous to be done. Also, there's a view of some of the Shafi'iyya that it is not to be done. It is not something to consider to be, they don't see that something which is encouraged to be done. And also the fourth view, it is that it is something which is wajib, to say bismillah in performing ghusl. And the evidence that have been mentioned regarding concerning that of those who say it is mustahab, of those who take the position it is mustahab to say bismillah fil ghusl, that of the evidence that they use the hadith that is mentioned, the hadith and Abi Hurairah ta'ala anhu قال قال رسول الله عليه السلام كل كلام أو أمر ذي بال لا يفتح بذكر الله عز وجل فهو أبتر أو أقطع. So that's concerning of the hadith that they use regarding this matter, where they mention the hadith meaning that every kalam or every affairs that of any importance, of any value, that is not open with bidhikrillah, without the mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَهُوَ أَبْتَرْ. It is something which is, they mention it is akhta, it is something which is incomplete. It is something which is incomplete. And they mention, or invalid, and this hadith, the ulama have mentioned this hadith, it is da'if. The ulama have mentioned that this particular hadith, that some kalam on the hadith, where they mention that the hadith is da'if. The hadith is da'if, وَمَتْرُهُ مُتَّرِب. So that's the ulama of hadith. I've said that hadith, that it is da'if. So they mentioned also that with the hadith, that based upon what is stated by this hadith, or what can be taken from this hadith of Abu Hurairah anhu, regarding that every matter of importance that is not started or bismillah is not mentioned before, then it is invalid. They mention also that you find that there's many matters, or matters where bismillah is not mentioned at the start. And there's matters where, yes, bismillah is mentioned at the start. So they mention so that all matters, all affairs, bismillah is to be said at the beginning. But some matters it is mentioned, but not all affairs. So of those matters, they mentioned that there's nothing sarih regarding, so they mentioned that, so also they use as a evidence, the second evidence that they use on this matter is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that this hadith have been narrated by many companions. And the meaning of the hadith mentioned, La salat illa bi wudhu, that there's no salat except with wudhu. Wala wudhu, and there's no wudhu, liman lam yuthkur ismAllah عليه, that and there's no wudhu for a one that did not mention Allah's subhanahu names over it, or at the start of it. So that's the hadith that they use also as a proof regarding this matter. And this particular hadith that is mentioned by many of the Sahaba, amongst them Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, Abu Hurairah, Salih bin Sa'd, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Sa'id bin Zayd, Anas, Aisha. So many of the companions have narrated this hadith, but all of the asanid of this hadith, all the narration of this hadith, that there's kalam about it. So all the narration of this hadith, where the Prophet mentioned, La salat illa bi wudhu, that there is no salat except with wudhu. Wala wudhu, and there is no wudhu, liman lam yadhkur ismAllah عليه, for the one who did not mention Allah's subhanahu name over it, or at the start of it. We said that now the hadith have been mentioned by many companions, but all the narrations, they have weakness within them. So of the approach of some of the ulama that they mention, because of so many companions that have narrated this hadith, that all of them combined together, that they elevate from da'if to hasan li ghayri, according to some of the ulama. And some mention the hadith, even though that they do not still, with the weakness in them, they are not per se elevated, or to be, when that they do not strengthen each other, where they reach the level of maqbool, to the extent of they consider to be hadith which is maqbool, which is acceptable, or hasan li ghayri, based upon the weakness in. So you have that discussion between the ulama regarding that hadith. So of those who affirm that hadith it is maqbool, hasan li ghayri, or hasan, they said that no, they use as their evidence. But I mentioned that this hadith, it mentioned regarding al-wudhu. So of those who mentioned, so they said the hadith is in relation to al-wudhu. As I mentioned, la wudhu liman lam yuthkur ismAllah عليه, that there's no wudhu for a one that did not mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name over it. So I said, no, we're discussing matter regarding al-ghusl, and this hadith is really in relation to al-wudhu. So there's nothing of those, as I said, so these are evidence regarding mustahab, where the ones who say it is mustahab said, we use this hadith to say regarding, yes, this hadith is specific regarding wudhu, but by way of qiyas, by way of analogy, it is used also regarding al-ghusl, as both the form of tahara, So if wudu, saying bismillah, is mustahab based upon this hadith, then also we apply this hadith regarding al-ghusl. So that's concerning that hadith. Of the response of those who say no, that regarding that this hadith also is regarding al-wudhu without mention of ghusl. This hadith regarding in relation to wudhu without mention of al-ghusl, and the Prophet ﷺ had many occasions that he performed ghusl, and there is no mention of ghusl to say bismillah. So reasons and cases with the Prophet ﷺ on occasions that he would perform ghusl, just as there were occasions that he performed wudhu, but he mentioned regarding wudhu, but there's nothing stated regarding al-ghusl for saying bismillah. So that says now based upon this that al-qiyas is not applied as the ghusl. There's reason for it, or a case where the Prophet ﷺ did perform ghusl on many occasions, but there's no report, whether sahih or daif, that the Prophet ﷺ ever said bismillah in performing ghusl. So that's kind of so. As for and also those who mentioned that it is not something which is mustahab, or that I mentioned there is no clear dalil to say that is mustahab or even wajib, that I mentioned that all the hadith that are somewhat authentic, that the hadith of Maymuna, the hadith of Aisha, that reports the Prophet ﷺ, the description of the Prophet ﷺ performing ghusl, there's no mention of bismillah. There's no mention of bismillah. So they mentioned that, they mentioned those hadith leaving out bismillah, it shows that it's not something which is a part of ghusl. It is not of those things to be said for ghusl. So that's concerning that matter. And also you have also the hadith of Salama regarding concerning to be mentioned. So there's no hadith that mentions ghusl that bismillah is mentioned along with it. Not hadith sahih, nor even hadith which is daif. So they mentioned that there's not by this, they take the position that it is something which is not a part of ghusl. It's not a part of ghusl. And the least to be said, it is something which is jahiz, based upon those who make al-qiyas upon wudhu. But overall, there's nothing authentic for it to be done. Nothing authentic regarding this matter. So that's concerning that matter regarding. So Jumhur of the ulama do take the position that to say bismillah for ghusl is something which is mashru', but also the view that because there is nothing authentic on this matter, whether or anything even daif upon the Prophet ﷺ regarding this matter, and no one have narrate and transmit anything regarding this matter, then it shows that that saying bismillah is something which is not mashru' in performing al-ghusl. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on this matter. These are the aqwal of the ulama on this matter. The next of the matter that is covered regarding and also stated in hadith, that of the other matter or other masala relating to this hadith that had been mentioned, where in some of the hadith it mentioned regarding concerning the Prophet ثم أفرغ على فرجه. So the matter that mentioned that in some of the hadith, that hadith of Maymuna, that the Prophet ﷺ, that he poured water over his, or he poured water on his farj, on his private areas. So of those things I discussed, فَغَسَلَهُ بِالشِّمَالِ, where he washed his private areas with his left hand. So they discussed concerning this matter. So next of those matters that is covered regarding Sifat al-Ghusl is regarding what's the hukum regarding the person, or at what point should the person perform or wash of his private parts. So they mentioned that the person should do so at the start of the wudhu. So in the early, so it should be done before performing al-wudhu. So to be done before. So they mentioned that so of those things that a person should wash of his private areas as a part of performing of ghusl. So on this matter, that the ulama regarding the person washing of his private area in performing ghusl. On this matter, that of the ulama yustahab liman arada al-ghusl, of the ulama take the position that the person who wishes to perform al-ghusl, then yustahab. It is something which is mustahab. It is something which is highly encouraged for a person, for them to wash of their private area. To wash of their private area. Whether the person and of those who take this position, that the ahnaf, so the of the ulama, that they take the position that the person in performing of ghusl, then it is mustahab for a person to wash his private ear and using his left hand. So wash of his private areas using of his left hand. And as I mentioned, that it is a sunnah mutlaqa, and that's the view taken by the ahnaf. So meaning when I said sunnah mutlaqa, where they don't make a distinction regarding with the person that he should wash his private ear, whether it is soiled by anything of semen or anything, or any discharge is there, or there's nothing there. So whether there's discharge that is there present on his private parts or around that area or not, regardless, he should wash his private area in performing of ghusl. So that's concerned the view they mention, it is ghusl al-farj sunnah mutlaqa. So regardless of whether it is any discharge around the area or not, the person should still wash of his private areas. That's concerned the view taken by the Ahnaf. That's the view taken by the madhab of the Hanafiya. And it should be done before al-wudhu, before performing al-wudhu. So the person, the early stage of performing his ghusl, he should wash of his private areas before he perform wudhu, and before he take a wash of his entire body. That's the view taken by the Ahnaf. A second view, قيل إن لم يكن هناك أذى, if there's no like discharge, semen, or any time of discharge, after perform that. So I mentioned that فإن لم يكن هناك أذى فلا حاجة إلى غسل فرج, that if there's no discharge that is there, then there's no need for the person to wash his private areas. So they mentioned that, and that's but if there is, then yes. If there's discharge around or there, or that is there on his private, where it is still wet or dried, but it is there, it is present there, then yes. But if not, then no. And that's the view that's taken by the madhab of the Shafi'iyah. So the Shafi'iyah, they make a distinction if there's any form of adha, which I mean adha in this case, any form of discharge. Yes, if there is, but if there is not any form of discharge, then a person should not. Then they say it should not. And they use concern the hadith of Maymuna, where she mentioned the hadith, وَغَسَلَ فَرْجُ وَمَا أَصَابَهُ مِنْ أَذَى. I mentioned that they wash its private area based upon that there was discharge that was there, because it was there was discharge present. And of those who mentioned that, so of the ulama mentioned that, so that's concerning aqwal of the ulama in summary on this matter, of those who say yes, to be done. And those who take the position that make a distinction regarding if there's any form of discharge of like of semen and others, or not, then if there is, yes, and if not, no. So that's concerning aqwal of the ulama on that matter regarding the person performing washing off that area, washing of the private parts. Then the next of the masail, and they mentioned that should be done before the person performs wudhu. So washing of that area should be done before performing of wudhu. And also they mentioned that the person washed that area, of those who mentioned that the person washed that area, so there's no need for the person again to wash it again when performing al-ghusl. So to wash it from the start, the onset, so as not for the person to wash it again after performing ghusl. The next of the masail that is discussed regarding sifat al-ghusl of what is mentioned, Then I mentioned the Prophet ﷺ, ثم ضرب بها الأرض. The person also that that is and. So I mentioned regarding concerns that use of earth, but I mentioned that that is something which is mustahab. Generally, something which is mustahab. It's not something which is wajib. If the person was to not do so, his wudu is ghusl is still valid. And if the person was then also to maybe use, rather than use of the dirt, then the person to cleanse off his hands, can a person use any other substitute, such as soap as we have today, that I mentioned, or detergent of soap of that nature, then I mentioned that it can be done. So it is a bar soap or it is liquid soap, then a person also can wash off his hands after washing of the private area. Then also that is of those things which is to be done. That is something which is mashru', but not to the extent of wajib. It's not something which is wajib, but also the person can use of other type of things to cleanse of his hands, of those soap, liquid or bar soap. So it shows the mashru'iyat of the person doing of this. Then also they discuss regarding the person washing of his hands. So also washing of his hands in performing of ghusl. So they mentioned that the ulama have mentioned regarding that it have been mentioned a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned the hadith of Aisha عنها, where she mentioned that كان رسول الله عليه السلام إذا اغتسل من الجنابة يبدأ بغسل يديه. So the hadith of Aisha عنها, it mentioned the Prophet ﷺ that whenever he performed al-ghusl for janaba, that يبدأ, that he would start فيغسل يديه, that he would start by washing both his hands. So hands that I mentioned regarding up to the wrist. So to the wrist of his hands, he will be wash off that part of his body. So they mentioned regarding concern this matter that it does mention the sunnah that a person he does so. That in the start of his wudhu, and Allah mentioned it is something that qabla, so before he wash off his private area, first the person start his ghusl by washing off his hands up to the wrist. Then he would, so as mentioned in the hadith of Maymuna, so it shows that this is something of, so and even before washing off his private parts, he would do so. So they show the permissibility of this act regarding doing of this. Some narration regarding washing of the hands, that some narration it mentioned some of these hadith, as in the hadith of Ibn Abbas and Maymuna زوج النبي عليه السلام قال توضأ رسول الله عليه السلام وضوءه للصلاة. The Prophet ﷺ performed wudu as that of salat غير رجليه, with the exception of his legs or feet. فغسل فرجه, then he washed his private parts. So this mention وما أصابه من أذى ثم أفاض ما عليه. So in this hadith of, and this narration of Ibn Abbas and Maymuna, and this narration is in the Bukhari. So Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned this hadith as he mentioned with the isnad, which he mentioned min tariq Sufyan and Amash and Salim ibn Abi Jad and Qurayb and Ibn Abbas and Maymuna. So this narration of Maymuna that he mentioned the Prophet ﷺ that he performed wudu as he would perform for salah without washing of his feet. Then after performing wudu, he'll wash his private parts. So we had mentioned before that majority of the ulama, mentioned that washing the private parts before performing wudu. But this hadith says different. Or this what it seems I've said different. I mentioned that he performed wudu wa ghasala farji. Then he washed and wash his private, and wash his private parts ma asaba min adha, from what was affected or what because of the adha that was there. So the ulama mentioned regarding concern that this hadith is to be understood. I mentioned by Ibn Hajar that this hadith is to be understood, that it doesn't per se contradict hadith before. It doesn't mention that wow. So this wow, as some the hadith of Aisha that it mentioned, that it mentioned that the hadith of Aisha, and also Maymuna mentioned that in the hadith mentioned that it mentioned thing by way of sequence, using the word thumma. But this hadith, this other narration of Maymuna used the word wow. So the hadith mentioning wow, that everything like combined together. So that mentioned per se, that mentioned everything combined together. So mentioned listing some of the things that he would do. But as for the hadith of Aisha and other narration of hadith of Maymuna, it kind of listing in order. It listing more in order by using the word thumma. As it mentioned the hadith of Aisha, كان رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام إذا اغتسل من جنابة يبدأ فيغسل يديه ثم يفرغ بيمينه على شماله. So it mentioned that order. ثم يغسل فرجه. Then it mentioned, so it mentioned ثم يتوضأ ثم يأخذ الماء. So it mentioned a tartib. So it mentioned like a sequence, an order in which the Prophet ﷺ performed ghusl. So in the order of the hadith of Aisha, it mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ washed his private area before he performed wudhu. So he started by washing his hands to risk, then pour water, his right onto his private and wash it with his left hand, then perform wudhu, then took water and then put it on his head, then after pour water over his entire body. Then he pour water, so the water in his head 3 times, then he pour water over, they mention ثم أفاض على ساهر جسده ثم غسل رجليه. So he mentioned that order. So he mentioned a certain order regarding the Prophet Islam performing al-ghusl. So the person starts with washing of his hands, then the private area, then wudhu, then water placed on his head 3 times, and then the entire body. And so that's the manner in performing al-ghusl. So the ulama discuss concerning that, so in washing, that again the person wash with his right hand, his private area with his left hand, not with his right. So he pours with his right if he's pouring from something, and he would use his left hand to wash that area and to wash that area. A discussion between the ulama regarding the person in washing his hand up to the risk 3 times. Does the person does so 3 times? So at the start of making his ghusl, does the person wash his hands right and left 3 times as one would do in wudhu or not? On this matter, that they mentioned that of the ulama mentioned that not mentioning 3 times. So the hadith regarding al-ghusl, that as to how many times, not mentioning 3 times regarding performing washing of his hands. So you have different narration. Of those narrations, that for example Abdullah ibn Umar رضي الله عنهما قال كان يعني رسول الله عليه السلام إذا اغتسل من جنابة بدها فأفرغ على يديه اليمنى فغسلها ثم غسل فرجه. There's no mention of 3 times. So they're not mention of 3 times. Then other narration mention hadith of Maymuna bint al-Harith قالت وضعت لرسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام غسله فستره فصب على يديه فغسلها مرة أو مرتين. So they mentioned that pour water on him. It mentioned مرة أو مرتين. قال سليمان, one of the narrator, لا أدري أذكر ثلاثة أم لا. Was it mentioned many 3 times or not? ثم أفرغ بيمين على شمال فغسل فرجه. So that mentioned that of the ulama, that narration, that of the hadith of Ibn Abbas, that and Maymuna, that it mentioned regarding concerning, and that narration also mentioned in Bukhari, that narration in Bukhari, that mentioned that it was done twice, either was done once, twice, or the narration mentioned لا أدري أذكر ثلاثا أم لا? Was it mentioned 3 times or no? So that's true. That so from this that I mentioned that that regarding doing so 3 times, doing so 3 times. So based upon that, these are of those other aqwal that I mentioned regarding al-ghusl, of the other aqwal that mentioned regarding al-ghusl. And as we have this, they discussed, as we have stated before, that hukum al-wudhu fil ghusl. So we have discussed that matter regarding hukum of performing wudhu in ghusl, and as we have mentioned that جمهور اتفق العلماء على مشروعية الوضوء لمن أراد أن يغتسل للجنابة. So the ulama are in agreement that the permissibility for a person to perform wudu in performing a ghusl. So there's something which can be done, and that's something which is legislated. Then they disagree whether it is something, this wudu, while performing ghusl, is it wajib or not. So you have a khilaf between the ulama of those who mention it is sunnah, and that's the view taken by jumhur of the ulama, and amongst them the Anafiyya, the Malikiyya, the Shafi'iyya, and the Hanabila, and also ikhtiyar Ibn Hazm. So majority of the ulama are of the opinion that wudu, performing wudu while performing ghusl, it is mustahab, it is sunnah. And as the view said, Hanafiyya, Malikiyya, Shafi'iyya, the Hanabila, and also Ibn Hazm amongst the Zahiriyya. Of the ulama who mention wudu shart fi sihhat al-ghusl, of the ulama who will take the position that performing wudu while performing ghusl, that it is shart for its being valid. So for the validity of ghusl, one must perform wudu. And that's, it's the position taken by Dawood al-Zahiri. So Dawood al-Zahiri wa Abi Thawr wa riwaya an Ahmed. So they take the position that performing wudu shart is a condition for the person, sihhat al-ghusl, for the person, for the validity of the person ghusl. So for the person performing ghusl, you must perform wudu. If it's not done, your ghusl is not valid. And that's the view taken by Dawood al-Zahiri, Abu Thawr, and also it is a riwayah on Imam Ahmed, عليهم جميعا رحمه الله تعالى جميعا. And also a view, وإن كانت, they make a distinction, وإن كان أجنب فهو محدث لزمه الوضوء, that a person in a state of janaba, but also he have done something that nullifies wudu, then the person has to perform wudu and ghusl. He has to perform wudu, must perform wudu with his ghusl. So that's concerning, they make a distinction regarding, so that's concerning of those aqwal of the ulama. And qawl regarding jumhur of the ulama, that is something which is sunnah, mustahab, then that is qawl sahih, that is qawl as-sahih. And that the person follow the Prophet alayhi salam sunnah and hadith the Prophet alayhi salam regarding this matter. So it is preferred for the person to do so. So that's no qawl jumhur, that that's the qawl that is authentic, that haka ibn Jarir ijma' ala sihhat al-ghusl bidun al-wudu. So you find that it has been stated by Ibn Jarir ijma', that ijma' that the person wudu is valid, the person ghusl, so ijma' that one's ghusl is valid if you did not perform wudu. So it's not condition, it's not a condition, even though, so said no, even though, so that ijma is not, can you find that of the ulama, Dawood, wa Riwayat Ahmed, wa Abi Thawr, that they place a condition that wudu must be done, but so the ijma is not an ijma. Dawood, Abu Thawr, Riwayat Ahmed go against this ijma. So it shows that it's not present ijma, but qawl of the jumhur of the ulama, and of the madhahib al-arba, and also Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, that says it's sunnah, mustahab, وليس بواجب ولا شرط. So that's the view that is more the correct opinion on this matter regarding performing wudhu while performing al-ghusl. If the person by chance missed performing wudhu at the start of their ghusl, so the person missed performing wudhu at the start of their ghusl, if the person do so after completing his ghusl. So after completing ghusl, is the person then to make up for missing his wudhu? Then no, it's not to be done. The Prophet ﷺ didn't do so. So not to be done, there's no need as performing ghusl. Then this also, it stands for his wudhu. It stands for it wudhu. And also that the person, if he was to perform wudhu first, then ghusl, is he then to repeat wudhu at the end? Then no. Then that also the person who does this practice, then that could fall into al-bidah. The Prophet ﷺ didn't do so. So the person did perform wudhu at the start of his ghusl, then perform ghusl of washing his entire body, then again repeat performing wudhu at the end. Then this is not to be done. This act, this practice, not to be done. So those are the masail that relates to this discussion. So that inshallah ta'ala will end of those other matters to be discussed in some of the hadith regarding sifatul ghusl. So we'll discuss other matters as they are mentioned with some of the hadith that follows. So that inshallah ta'ala will end this discussion and other matters relating to ahkam al-ghusl or sifat al-ghusl. And inshallah ta'ala we'll continue next session regarding others of these masahil and matter that relates to ahkam al-ghusl wal janaba. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهادي إلى السبيل والآخر والحمد لله.